All right, everyone. So I just got done watching the Netflix series Death by Lightning. Now, this is going to be filled with spoilers, okay? And this isn't something that's going to be all like, the historical accurate facts, all right? I'm just talking about this Netflix series. So if you haven't seen it yet, click out of the video now. There's going to be spoilers. Don't want to spoil it for anyone. And I also want to be very clear that I'm not judging any of this on historical accuracy. Okay. I'm only talking about what we saw in this four-part series. And I'll tell you this, I watched them one after the other, after the other, after the other, because this was so good. The way they tell the story of President James Garfield and the one who ends up assassinating him, Charles Guiteau, and how it's, you really get to know both men and obviously Chester Arthur as well, and all the other key political players in this. You really get a sense because this is a four-part series. You really get to know them as people. If this was a 2-hour movie, I really think it wouldn't be able to do the justice that it did in this in terms of really getting to know each character, right? You by the end of this, you know James Garfield, right? You feel like it's something of wow, maybe I haven't learned a lot about this guy, but you feel like you know him, right? And what's driving him and what type of man he is. The same with Charles Guiteau, right? You really feel like, wow, okay, this is how this man got to this place to do such a heinous thing. And then even after that, a lot of um, you know, movies like this or series like this, telling a story, they would end immediately at the point of, obviously Garfield's death, but we get more after that, right? We see the aftermath and what Charles Guiteau thinks is going to happen. And I'm going to kind of start at the end actually, because I think the end is actually a great place to start, where you see James Garfield's wife, the first lady, meeting Guteau, right? And basically, she lays the smackdown on him, right? She makes a point that I think is, obviously in this day and age, so true, right? Where she says the last question he asked me was, "Would I be remembered?" And she tells him, "Yes, yes." And well, the exact thing she said was, "Yes, you will." But then she kind of swerves around it by saying, "And loved in people's hearts," right? So she's talking about obviously her family in that sense and the American people, but she's talking about her and her family. And then she tells Guteau, "I was lying to him in that moment because he was only here for 3 months. He's going to be forgotten to history." And it is true because when you watch this four-part series, you really get the sense that Garfield is a man that was on a path of just extreme change, right? He was fixing the problems of the day, rampant corruption, right? And the amazing part of this wasn't a situation of a politician from the opposing party taking power and then making changes, right? And that's how things go. This is somebody who didn't even seek the office, right? Which I looked that up before I did this video because I wanted to see, was that true? And according to everything I'm reading, that was 100% true. A man that was not even seeking the office comes in and fixes it all from within, right? So this wasn't at this time, and obviously we're talking historically, so it's not going to go Republican and Democrat in today's world, right? But in this time, a Republican, right? The party of Lincoln, he comes from within, right? This wasn't a Democrat that comes in and fixes things. This is a Republican from Lincoln's own party. And obviously, Grant was the one that was they were talking about and begins to fix the corruption. And at the end, they show Chester Arthur beginning to do that through civil service reforms. That's what they put at the end. And I'm guessing all of that is 110% historically accurate. But as we go from that moment, I thought that was the most powerful part, and they put it right at the end, just as it should be. Because you really think about it after watching all of this and having that land on you, you go, I want to go learn about this guy, right? I want to know more. This is not somebody who, you just you think about all the great presidents throughout American history. And this is not a name that comes up, right? But now you get to learn about him. You see this, and I am so happy after hearing that ending that this was made. And I hope this is something that's done more, right? We want to hear more stories about these presidents, not just the ones that end in tragic fashion like this, you know? And by the end, you really feel it when he's killed. You really have a hatred for Charles Guiteau, right? There's no part of this where you're like, oh man, this is just a guy that went down a bad path. You really have a sense of hate for him because not just what he did, but you see the reaction from the family at that last scene when they're all sitting at the table, and it's almost like you have two people that came from these rough backgrounds, right? And one of them is the ultimate image of the type of leader you would want. Somebody who's really looking out for others almost more than himself. And it's interesting because at the end, even though this was a man that wasn't seeking the presidency, even though this was by far, someone who was very humble, right? And someone who didn't who was seeking the best and took the hardest path, right? He could have just gotten elected and gone about his business, right? There was no he could have had the entire he could have done exactly what the corruption that had come before him. He could have just done that again. He could have took all this time, right, to kind of make change everything around, get himself put in as president as he did. Obviously, ended up being elected, and then just use the same machine. Right? They could have done that, and that would have been the path of least resistance. He didn't choose that, and I also found it quite interesting, and I don't know if this was actually the truth of it, but the way he was not the president when all these reforms went through, but even though it was Chester Arthur doing it, it was only because of Garfield, right? Garfield was the one that was look. The bottom line is Arthur was out there willing to do all of this corrupt stuff. Still, he wasn't willing to stand up to the corrupt interests. It was only after Garfield, right? In Garfield's honor that he was able to do it. And you also see, even the other politicians, right? Because there's a lot of other politicians that we see, and all of them have their own interests and they're all battling it out, and it's all self-interest driven. And Garfield really changed it, right? It was in his kind of his example that ended up doing it, right? But at the end, even after all of that, right, and we see the selflessness, we see what type of leader he is, you get a little glimpse of actually, this is a person that was thinking about legacy. Actually, this was a person that was thinking, am I going to be remembered, right? And so the fact that you know that he has those things in his head, in his last moments, and yet still throughout his entire time in politics, right? He is not someone driven by self-interest. I think shows you the man he is, right? So this was someone who probably, deep in his head was always like, "Oh man, I would love to be president of the United States so I could fix this and fix that," right? But he's not willing to do what these other people were doing. He's not driven by self-interest to get it done. And I thought that was just such a powerful like I said, the ending was just so powerful. And I think my major takeaway from this was I want to see more of all these presidents that we've had throughout history. Yeah, ones that are just not as known. You hear the stories of all the great presidents all the time, right? But Garfield, this was a story. Let's be very clear. This was a story of a great president. There's no other way to explain it. He was in for 3 months. And that I guess according to this, it was 3 months. I don't know if it was 3 months was the actual amount of time, but it was a short time nonetheless, right? And what if we're judging on a scale here of 3 months, 3 months, 3 months, I'm not sure there's a man that had a bigger impact based off this short series. So I hope we see more of them. There are more of these president stories, and it just I like I said, I thought it told the stories from so many different perspectives all at the same time. Even though it was told obviously with Garfield as the main character of it, you don't really feel like we're just tracking Garfield. You're tracking all of the political climate at this time in this, and like I said, I don't think a movie in and of itself would do it justice. I don't think 2 hours would do it justice. And I'm looking at the times now, as you can see right here. 52 minutes, 47 minutes. So, and then an hour and six. So, a little more than, certainly, this is more than your typical movie length, right? But there's just something about the way it was structured, something about the way it went. It really was a great series. So, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. And this is something I'm probably going to watch again at some point. That's really how good it is, right? It is absolutely phenomenal. Thank you all for watching.